2. Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. For those of you watching out in video land on WNS TV or our YouTube channel or our Facebook channel or anywhere you millennial types get things on your phones when you're not on my lawn, this may be the final purple light segment we're going to do here. I don't know. Luke, I mean, I love these lights, and I think they might look good like sort of roped up behind me. So I'm working on maybe somehow incorporating them into the general motif, the way I have the Sporticulture lava lamp here. It's not purple season anymore. I guess it's always purple season, but the hardest part of this is you got to go cover baseball now. And, we're going to watch the Terps blow, games on the road and be getting blown out in the first half anywhere they play in a Big Ten gym. Lacrosse fans are there. You and your brother will be off to some wrestling match, and I'll have some concert to go to as long as my legends aren't dying. I know it won't be a Rush concert, R.I.P. Neil Peart. But the offseason happens now, and we're just a part of it. We're just one of the other 28 teams right now, right?
Yeah, we know the Ravens are going to pick 28th in the draft, as opposed to many people thinking they're going to be 32nd, and they have some pretty good cap space. There's no question about that. It's not where they can write a blank check or offer a blank check to anyone they want to, because they do have some big contracts that they're going to have to be doing, whether it's this offseason or sometime in the next 12 months. Ronnie Stanley, Marlon Humphrey, Lamar Jackson probably a year from now, because Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson, you're already hearing talk about their contracts coming up this offseason, or extensions, I should say. So it doesn't stop. It keeps going. And for Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh and the scouts, the coaching staff, Steve Bisciotti, they're all going to be in various capacities getting together and putting together their off-season plan. And for the Ravens, like I said, they do have cap space. They do have some attractive draft picks that they certainly can use to augment this football team. But I think you do look at where they stand, not so much on the offensive side of the ball, although Marshall Yanda, until we hear for sure whether he's coming back or not, he's under contract, but Marshall said the last couple of years he's year to year, and he didn't want to talk about his future after the game. But really, you look at the defensive side of the ball and some of the free agents that they have. We've talked about Judon. Jimmy Smith's a free agent, Michael Pierce, Patrick Owasso. You go down the list, there's a number of guys that aren't necessarily franchise-altering, season-altering type of signings or departures potentially, but guys that have played an important role here. So we get into that conversation as far as how it's going to play out with those individuals. And as we always know, and this is part of the pain of this, and Judon talked about this after the games, late Saturday night, probably around midnight at that point, he said, even if we come back next year and we're right back in this position and we get over the hump, we know it's going to be a different team. And some of the guys that are in this locker room aren't going to be here anymore. And there's always that. I think that's what always makes the end of the season so difficult. If you're in the playoffs, it's so abrupt. Whether
car crash was Judon's, right?
Yeah. It's so abrupt. Unless you get to the Super Bowl and you know that you either win and you're a champion or you lose and you're, it's cold to say it, but in at least some capacity, you're just like the other 30 teams that didn't win the Super Bowl. But when the clock hit zero Saturday night, that there were guys who played their final game with the Ravens, and potentially some guys that are significant. And again, I think it kind of begins with what happens with Marshall Yanda. He's under contract. We know that. He signed that one-year extension last spring, which I think was really a mechanism to offer some cover, offer some protection for both parties. It's nice for him to be under contract and not thinking about being a free agent if he wants to continue playing. And on the Ravens side, certainly keeping an 8-time Pro Bowl, arguably Hall of Fame talent, keep him under contract. But
you know what? That's interesting. We're going to have that conversation in 2 weeks, right? Like, is he a Hall of Famer? Is he not? Or does he have something left to do? Or could he do something? And same thing with Suggs, right? Suggs is playing football again this week.
Yeah.
And Suggs could be sitting on the dais 2 weeks from now saying, all I wanted to do was go to Baltimore, and I'm so happy to be a Chief. You know what I mean? Like, literally.
Yeah, you never really know.
Man, it is weird how this stuff works out. I mean, Ryan Tannehill with a chance. Hey, how about this? Either Ryan Tannehill is going back to Miami or Terrell Suggs is going to the Super Bowl as a Kansas City Chief. One of those two things is going to happen 2 weeks from now. That's kind of crazy.
No question about it. I mean, you'll always find those weird stories. I mean, how about Darius Smith? Let's give him a little bit of love for a second.
Oh, my. How about that?
Everyone thought he was going to be the next Ravens defensive player to go somewhere else. And, hey, good for him. Get paid. No question about it. But no one, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I expected Darius Smith to do what he's done for the Packers this year. He's been terrific, and he's been a leader for that team. And, I mean, as much as, you look at Aaron Rodgers, and he played really well Sunday night, but the Packers, their defense is really set the tone.
I looked up, man. Darius is crawling on his hands and knees and eating, man.
Yeah, I mean, he had 13.5 sacks this year, Nestor. I mean, how many times have we talked about those Ravens defensive players that have gone on and gotten paid elsewhere? And hey, good for them. You make a couple more zeros on that paycheck than you had in Baltimore. Good for you. But so few really made an impact. A couple guys, Bart Scott was good to really good for a couple years with the Jets, and then it kind of went away. Same with Adalis Thomas. I mean, there are a few guys, but for the most part, we know that story. But Darius Smith was terrific this year. So it is always funny to watch those kind of stories, but those types of stories are also how you weigh what's going to happen with this current roster. I mean, you look at Darius Smith, does that make the Ravens a little more inclined to say, okay, this might have been what how we would have valued Matt Judon last year or the year before, or how we would have handled it 5 years ago? But I don't know now. I mean, Darius Smith, look what he did somewhere else. It's
hard to get good football players, especially when you identify them. And hey, by the way, for whatever we say about Ozzie and Eric and where they are in the offseason, I have been impressed with their ability even when things don't work out, whether it's Perryman, who goes on and does something else, or John Simon, or Lawrence Guy, or Zadarius Smith, or I just look up week after week and I see these guys, as well as coaches. Mike Pettine still coaching deep into the with a chance, dear friend of mine, to win a Super Bowl here, and he was not a part of the first Super Bowl, and he was one of the tweener guys that was here between the two Super Bowls, right? So it is. You watch these guys do this over the course of time, and you say they really do identify talent. Maybe it doesn't always work out. Maybe Timmy Jernigan needs to go to Philadelphia and win himself a ring or something like that. But they identify talent here. Even the linebacker from UCLA that flamed out may not flame out, right?
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, Kenny Young, I think, only played special teams for the Rams.
Understand.
But, yeah, sure. But no, your point's well taken. And this is, and I'm going to be very clear here.
I mean, even Tyrod Taylor went on and won some games. You know what I mean? He never was given a chance. But I'm just thinking of guys that went other places and made some money and did okay and played and proved they were NFL players. We're still playing football when they were 29 or 30. How about that?
Sure, and I think that's where it's important to recognize how relative it is when you're trying to evaluate the draft. We can talk about the draft misses that the Ravens had after Super Bowl 47, and they had some big ones. There's no question about that. But for people to look at that and say, well, the Ravens completely lost their touch and they're really bad at drafting players, and different stuff you hear when you go 5-11 in 2015, or you've missed the playoffs 3 straight years, 4 out of 5 years, as the Ravens did from 13 through 2017. But I think it's a reminder that, no, they weren't bad at drafting. What happened more than anything was they regressed to the mean some, and that information that used to be so proprietary as far as when you would evaluate players and scout, so much of that is just available to everyone now. These pro days and different data collecting that they do.
And the more data that's out there, the more secretive Eric DeCosta becomes, right?
Yeah, the stuff that the Ravens do in-house, they're going to be really secretive about that. But that said, that doesn't mean they haven't been beyond reproach, and I'd be disingenuous if I didn't mention how much I was critical of where they were from a draft philosophy standpoint. As far as how heavily they went towards defense for that 5-6 year period after the Super Bowl. Meanwhile, you pay your quarterback all this money, and what parts does he even have around him? But anyway, moving on from that, it is a reminder though that yes, they haven't been terrible at drafting football players, and even some guys that ended up not being a good fit here in Baltimore have gone on and had some success elsewhere. I mean, Rashad Perriman, look at what he did at the very end of the season for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, that was kind of a nice story. I mean, I always liked Rashad personally. I mean, I felt for him as far as not being able to stay healthy his first couple years, but clearly he's in an environment now where he found a little more confidence. He's able to stay on the field, and it's worked out for him to a modest degree. So, that kind of stuff. And I'll also say this, unless you're really horrendous at drafting, there are players that are drafted somewhere that are playing elsewhere all around the league. I mean, the Ravens have guys right now that that weren't necessarily successful in their original landing spot, and they've come to Baltimore and they found some success. So you see some of that, but yeah, it is a reflection of where the Ravens have been for a long time, and I think it's also a reminder of there's reason to have a lot of trust that the Ravens are going to come back, and maybe they're not going to be 14-2 next year, but there's no reason to think they're not going to win this division and be back in the playoffs. And you hope that they can make the right tweaks here and there and internally make some improvements here and there and come out and not do what happened in the divisional round this year. So there's certainly a long way to go, a lot of work to do between now and then, but again, no reason to think that the future isn't very bright still here in Baltimore, even with some difficult decisions and what's going to ultimately be some departures and some arrivals that we're going to see here over the next few months.
As we say that, they can't lose any more games. They can't do anything wrong other than, doing stupid stuff in the offseason, whether it's getting themselves into trouble or finding accidental trouble. Any of that, all of that aside, literally everything that happens now is about the coaches and about the talent evaluators, right? You talk about the plane crash, well, then the plane takes off again for evaluating Senior Bowl and games and Indianapolis and getting ready for a draft and all the offseason. And then you find out whether you have superstars in that capacity, whether you have a Lamar Jackson running your organization. Hey, man, I'm bullish on Eric because, I've been knowing Eric for a quarter of a century, and I think my relationship with Eric's changed, through the 25 years of doing this and where he sort of sits alone in a dark room with all these people figuring out all this stuff and trying to make a 14-2 team and figure out a way to revolutionize the game and all of that. But the recent history of bringing in the players that they brought in defensively to get to the point where they could get to 14-2 and then not have anybody able to tackle Derrick Henry. I would think Eric would even agree, because he's intelligent, that the pendulum swings, right? Like, to your point, the pendulum was they didn't have DBs, right? You beat them up for that. Now they got that. They didn't draft on the offense. Well, now they got Lamar and Hollywood and all these they draft for that, right? They spent too much money on the quarterback. Now they got a cheap quarterback that's Michael Jordan, and now they got cap space. It's the first time they got cap space. Where are they going to spend it? I would think that they're going to, like you pointed out, fortify the linebacker thing, which was sort of the core thing of number 52 that began the whole party now, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it always comes full circle, and when you have a salary cap, you're always going to have some weaknesses or relative weaknesses, let's say. And I want to be clear. I mean, they did a fantastic job of patchworking this front seven when you look at where it was in the first month of the season and bringing in the Josh Bynes and the Jihad Wards and different guys like that all made different contributions to various degrees. But I think we all knew that Josh Bynes is a Band-Aid, not a long-term solution, strictly by age. I mean, and that's not to say they can't bring Josh Bynes back or shouldn't bring him back, but you're hoping over the course of, whether you're talking free agency, there are going to be other pass rushers out there, whether it's keeping a Judon or whether some team throws him way too much money and the Ravens see better value in another free agent, and then they draft another edge rusher in the first or second round. However they do it. There's more than one way to do this, to approach this. But I think it's clear that edge rusher, inside linebacker, I think certainly with Michael Pierce, the likelihood of him getting a big contract and whether you're going to be willing to do that, although I'll also mention Brandon Williams, isn't getting any younger or less expensive. So, there's clearly decisions to be made in that regard. But I think it's very clear edge rusher, inside linebacker are the two big ones. Just the linebacker position in general for the Ravens. They need to be more consistent setting the edge, and that's not to say that a young guy like a Jalen Ferguson isn't a part of that. But I think you have to also hedge your bets with some of your young guys because you know that Jalen Ferguson might be much more of a Courtney Upshaw type than the likelihood of him being anything close to Terrell Suggs over the next few years. So, in fact, I'd even say you'd be happy if he's Courtney Upshaw because Courtney Upshaw was a solid 4-year starter for the Ravens, even if he wasn't an all-pro talent or anything like that. So you're always weighing that, and they have draft picks and they have cap space, and they'll have some guys that they're going to look to that you're going to have to make decisions on. I mean, Tony Jefferson, I think most of us would probably assume at this point he's going to be a cap casualty because
Brandon Carr's another. I mean, we got some older guys on the team, right?
Yeah. And you got to make tough decisions, and it's not.
I mean, Anthony
personal.
Levine didn't really get on the field
as much as he used to,
as much as he did before. They feel like they upgraded from that, which should tell you some part of positioning there. But he's such a great special teams player and a leader and a captain and a champion, all that stuff. I don't know how they really feel, but I do feel like they're well led. I feel like whatever Eric's doing, it's not going to be led by money or emotions or any of that, right? Like. It feels to me like that he's on his game. A year into this, he's well prepared to do this. His organization, Ortiz, all these guys, as well as Kokinis in the middle of the season to be able to be plugging Jihad Wards and L.J. Forts and Justin Ellis's and Bynes and Damata Peck. I mean, you just go down the list. They were on quite a roll, right? I mean, for what they were trying to do.
Sure. I mean, what they did in season, it was impressive. But I think they knew, and they knew it when they signed those guys. I mean, Domata Peko was not a long-term type of addition. That was a 6-week addition or 8-week, whatever it was. So you know that from a long-term standpoint now, the draft remains the lifeblood of this organization. I mean, it is the absolute, it's where things begin and end for them. Times where they've drafted not just middle of the pack, times where they've drafted extremely well, that's when they set themselves up for an amazing run. I mean, Ozzie Newsome's the first to tell you that Jonathan Ogden and Ray Lewis and then Ed Reed coming along a couple years later and then Terrell Suggs coming along the year after that made him way smarter, made everyone way smarter because you're talking about transcendent talent. And even though I'm not going to sit here and put Lamar Jackson with those guys from the standpoint of Lamar would be the first to tell you he has a lot to prove for a long time before he's in that kind of conversation because I just mentioned Hall of Fame players right there. But when you have a transcendent talent at the quarterback position, it makes everything easier. It just does. It makes everything easier, better, smarter, more tenable, especially on a rookie contract, which the clock's ticking on that because, again, you're looking at next winter is going to be when the Ravens are looking at doing a contract with him. I mean, that's, 3 years into a rookie contract is when you can start talking extension. That's where the Chiefs are going to be with Mahomes in the coming weeks whenever their run ends. And same thing with the Texans.
That might get expensive for the Chiefs, huh?
Oh, yeah, with Deshaun Watson, too, for the Texans. I mean, hey, Lamar's going to be making insane. Anyone that wants to look at that playoff game and throw shade and say, see, I told you, all of his many critics who were just lying in the weeds waiting for Saturday night to happen to tell you I told you so. First of all, that seems really petty because everyone was wrong about Lamar to some degree, even his biggest supporters. No one thought he was going to be MVP in year 2.
Yeah, I'm bored with a lot of that. Even as a sports radio guy, I'm just like...
Well, my point is, he's going to be just as expensive as all those other guys, even if he's a little different, even if what he does isn't quite as conventional as some of the other great young quarterbacks in the league, he's not going to be any cheaper. So it's just, that's something to keep in mind. And that's why I say, even though the Ravens have this cap space, roughly $30 million going into the offseason, and that's before, potentially moving on from a guy like Jefferson or Brandon Carr or James Hurst, different candidates we'll talk about at various points over the next month or two.
Or Marshall Yonda, who moves on from them.
You can save you can save some cap space if he retires, but then you got to replace Marshall Yonda. So that's a hole. That's not a hole. That's a canyon right there as far as what he still means to this team. But you do have to remember, Ronnie Stanley is probably going to be looking to become the highest paid left tackle in the NFL, and he played like it this year, by the way. We didn't talk nearly enough about how great Ronnie Stanley was this year, because he's someone that in previous years I would say he's good, but I'm wondering if there's another level. Well, he hit that level this year, by the way. He played for at least 1 year, he played at a Jonathan Ogden kind of level for at least a season. That's how good he was.
Well, especially for what they needed him to do.
Yeah, exactly. So my point is, his contract's coming. We already talked about Judon. They paid Marcus Peters. Marlon Humphrey's going to want to get paid, and he's not going to be cheap because keep in mind, he's only 23 years old. So,
well, they just gave money to Peters, right? So, not that kind of money, but when that kind of money comes up for Humphrey, they're going to have to be sure on him,
Yeah, well, and
we're getting there.
I don't think there's any reason not to be sure on him. He played at a Pro Bowl level this year.
But being sure, they were sure. C.J. Mosley was pretty good, but they weren't sure $17 million. They like $4. So,
and that's also why you can't let guys hit the market, though. I mean, they dragged their feet on C.J. Mosley, and look, they went 14-2 without him. I think things were okay. But.
Hold on a second, though. If C.J. Mosley takes the money, Earl Thomas isn't here, right?
Well, and that's the thing. And that's why I'm I can remember years ago, it was the offseason that the Orioles ended up signing Chris Davis, and you and I talked about it and whether they were going to keep him or not. And so many people thought the Ravens or the Orioles had to keep Chris Davis, and they did.
Oh, I still give Moeller a hard time about his. He has some status up there.
There has been a lot of revisionist history there. There's no question about that.
I think the quote was, "I'm done with them." Right?
Yeah. It's so much. But my point at the time was, there are very few, and I mean very, very, very few players in any sport where you absolutely must keep them. There are always different paths to success. It's just you have to have the right people in place to navigate the correct.
Well, remember the Raiders got rid of Khalil Mack, and it's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And the Bears were great last year, but both of Khalil Mack's teams didn't make the tournament this year, right? So.
Yeah, and I'll say this: if the Raiders,
how about the Browns?
If the Raiders hit on some of those picks that they got for him, then okay. But the point is,
but the Browns loaded up. Remember when they loaded up too?
Yeah.
Let's value the offseason the way it's the offseason. You only get to go 14-2 in the real season.
Well, hey, the offseason's critically important. It's just evaluating it during the offseason. Time will tell.
It's 0-0 is the evaluation, always until September, right?
In the same way that I really laugh how people want to judge head coaching hirings. Right there. It's a good hire or it's a bad hire.
Joe Judge, it's great. His name's Judge. I love Judge Judy and Judge Wapner. Boom.
None of us have any idea. Okay, maybe the rare, who was the guy that the 49ers hired? Tom Sulo. Where he, or you look at what happened with McAdoo with the Giants, like right off the bat, you got a weird vibe about that. But save for those really rare exceptions, we have no idea, because I can remember once upon a time how many Ravens fans were pining after Chris Palmer to be their head coach, and they wound up having Brian Billick. I can remember how many Ravens fans were pining after Jason Garrett to be their head coach, and they got turned down even, and they had to settle for John Harbaugh.
The people here wanted Lawrence Phillips, and don't let him tell you anything.
Yes. So, again, it's not, hey, we have to talk about it, so we give our opinions based on the time, but for all I know, who knows? Maybe Kevin Stefanski is going to be the next Vince Lombardi, and he's going to be the guy that turns the Cleveland Browns around.
God, I hope not.
I'm guessing probably not, and it's not because of Kevin Stefanski. It's about everyone else in that organization, quite frankly. So, but I always laugh because we we judge the offseason, we judge head coaches, we judge different moves. The draft, every year we talk, people give their grades for the draft, and we just don't know how it's going to play out. It's fun to talk about, and we can give our opinions, but I'm not going to sit here and say that I have any idea who these new head coaches, how they're going to fare in their new environment, because it's a different job than being an offensive.
I know the Redskins will still suck, and I'll tell Jack when we get together because it's the Redskins.
Yeah, although I'll say this, I think Ron Rivera and Jack Del Rio, and they did as well as they possibly could to hire those guys now. But you still come back to Daniel Snyder. You still come back to Daniel Snyder being there.
There's other stuff going on there
exactly.
that cuts to the aorta. Here's Luke Jones, Luke at WNST.net. He's going to be Baltimore Luke on Twitter. He's going to be Orioling and chirping. God bless them at Wisconsin, and probably watch Purdue blowing out Michigan State. Early in the game from the hospital suite on Sunday as well. So I did hear the squeak of the sneakers on the hardwood, Luke, and I thought, well, it's something we're going to do twice a week for a little while, because thinking football and being football and all of that, back to Matthew Judon, it was a car crash on Saturday night. It really was, right?
It hurts, and there's other things to occupy your time, your leisure time, and big thing with the Terps, not just them, the Big Ten in general. Look at some of the top teams and look at the road records. It's been a disaster in that way. It's hard to figure out heads to tails with the Big
By the way,
Ten
I was watching again. I'm literally sitting. My wife spent 10 hours in the emergency room Sunday, and I'm sitting in there. She finally got television working and whatnot, and what's going on, and the game comes on, and it's Michigan State and Purdue, and I'm like, man, Mackey, that day we spent at Mackey, I'm like, that was a great day. College basketball, just a game like that has no bearing on me much. It's only on, and I'm watching it because it just happens to be on, right? The notion that, the Big Ten, this could be a lot of fun if Maryland could make it fun, right? If Maryland really were the third-ranked team in the country right now and they were winning the games they're supposed to win, all of that stuff that we thought 4 weeks ago, right? That this would at least be a little bit of a cushion at this point. Yeah. I'm not a believer Maryland's going to the Final Four. I'm just not.
I'm not. You know my feelings about Mark Turgeon. I don't think he's a terrible coach. Let me be clear about that. But I'm not a believer.
But there's no soft landing, I guess. Now. And we're gonna we'll be talking about that for the next 10 minutes.
We'll have plenty of time to talk about it. But what I'm seeing from Maryland to this point in the season feels very familiar, doesn't it? It just does.
Maryland, we're all behind you. So is this the point where I retire my purple lights?
I don't know. Well, you said they're from 2006, and I know, hey, you know me, I'm not a jinx guy, but I don't know. With this happening again,
as Art Modell stares at me here in the picture, I think of David Modell.
Some other lights. Look on eBay or something. I don't know.
You know what? It is the anniversary of David Modell's death today. He died on a Friday the 13th. Believe it or not, he died on the 13th of January. So today's the 13th of January. I'm gonna, if the spirit of David Modell tells me that I need to get rid of these. Because he was the most superstitious human being I know.
I remember that, right.
And I actually reread his the 4-page thing I wrote when he passed a few years ago, and it just got me thinking and laughing a little bit about superstitions and the Ravens and the legacy and how much of Don't Be a Jerk and the color purple and the Ravens bird, and David was very alive to me on Saturday night. I can even conjure up a smile about how disappointed he'd be in 14-2 because David would say, I lived through the drive, I lived through the fumble, and we still won a champion. Holding the cigar. I can hear David saying that. So we'll survive, and if Lamar's meant to win a Super Bowl, like everybody seems to think he is, it'll happen in purple and our day will come, right? Literally.
And this will be part of this season, not necessarily this season, but Saturday night will be this Ravens era.
You know what? Maybe this. How about
Billy
this?
Cundiff
How about this?
Evans.
If Lamar wins next year, I will get Edwin Muliki Mulatalo to bring some cuckoo and nuts to celebrate, much like Arthur B. had. So maybe it wasn't meant to be this year. Maybe it's meant to happen in Tampa.
It didn't happen.
That's a good point. All right. That's why I keep you around. You make sense. You do make sense. He is Luke Jones in Baltimore. Luke, on that, we're going to drop the mic. I'm sure we'll do more radio before we get to South Beach. But Luke, I'm going to let you have that, man. You slam the door. Shut the trunk. Nasty at WNST.net. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat. Maybe it wasn't meant to be because it didn't happen. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore. The comedy is unintentional, I assure you. You can't laugh. You got to cry.